Good afternoon, buonasera. It's a great honor for me to open this conference on Nostra Aetate, and especially because this mastermind of Nostra Aetate was Cardinal Bea, and Cardinal Bea was the rector of the Pontifical Biblical Institute. So it's really a great honor for us to open this and host this conference. I think that Cardinal Bea had this fantastic vision, and I think it was a great intuition that the dialogue is extremely important. Jewish-Christian dialogue, it's very important. And I think that especially now, in the moments when we are witnessing to a lot of violence in all sides, and to have some people who believe and who have this idea that the dialogue is important, I think this is key to further solutions. And it's very easy to speak about the dialogue because many people speak about the dialogue. But if you don't believe in it, it doesn't go ahead. And what I think, we have here two people who organized this conference, and it's Father Craig Morrison, who is the Dean of the Oriental Faculty, and Massimo Gargiulo, who is the Director of the Centro Bea. And I think that these two people are the incarnation of this belief. They really believe in it. And thanks to them, we have this conference. And I'm very happy that you are here, all the participants, all the speakers, and I hope this might be a next step or small step in this dialogue. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. As Peter Dubowski said, I am Massimo Gargiulo, and I am the Pro-Director of the Cardinal Bea Center for Jewish Studies here at the Pontifical Gregorian University. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. First of all, I would like to thank the President of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Peter Dubowski, because it was very important to collaborate with such a prestigious institution in organizing today's conference. And I would like also to thank Craig Morrison, because it has been a real pleasure to work with you. And so thank you so much, Craig. And most of all, thank you all for being here. And thanks also to our administrative staff that, as usual, made a huge work to make things work as we hope they will work. So this is the first event of 2025 dedicated to the 60th anniversary of the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate. As you may know, there will be another conference in October, which we are organizing in collaboration with the Center for Interreligious Studies of the Pontifical Gregorian University. And this will be followed by a day specifically dedicated to the section on Judaism of the conciliar document. So as Cardinal Bea Center, this is an integral part of our academic program and stems from a desire not only to celebrate such a significant event, but also to look to the future, despite the challenges of recent times that we are all aware of. The conference opening today aligns precisely with this vision. In addition to a historical perspective, particular attention is given to the Jewish identity of Jesus and to the so-called within Judaism methodological approach. All of this is closely linked to education, as the future of Nostra Aetate will ultimately be in the hands of those who are now our students, to whom goes my special thanks today for being here. The diversity of approaches is complemented by the desire to highlight the ancient and vital presence of Judaism in our world here in Rome. For this reason, we have organized a visit to the synagogue at the archaeological site of Ostia Antica, reminding ourselves that in ancient Rome there were more than 10 synagogues. I will now leave the floor to our speakers, and thank you to Professor Sievers to be the chairperson of this session.
Thank you, and again, welcome to everybody. I have taught here for many years, but I've rarely sat up here. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce the speakers. And the first one will be Dr. Michael Pfister from Münster. He has been an Akademischer Rat or lecturer at the Department of Medieval and Modern Church History at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Münster since October 2021. His research concentrates on various aspects of 20th century church history, history of theology, churches in the Weimar Republic and in the Third Reich, politics and diplomacy of the popes and the Roman Curia in the 20th century. In this field, he has collaborated on a critical edition of Eugenio Pacelli's reports when he was nuncio in Germany, and these reports are available online freely. He also has dealt with ecumenism and Jewish-Christian dialogue before the Second Vatican Council. So most specifically, his published 2020 dissertation, which is also available online via open access, deals precisely with Augustin Bea's years at the Biblicum here, the topic of this evening's presentations. So we are looking forward to hearing an outsider who has become an insider in the archives of the Biblicum. We are looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction and your warm welcome. I hope you can understand me, okay? Yes, it is me a pleasure and an honor to speak here in the Biblicum, where I was working in the archive and now in this Aula Magna. It is fantastic. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to start with a quote. My whole life was, in God's plan, a preparation for this task. I would not be able to do what I have to do today if I did not have to take on so many duties and assignments. End of quote. In 1962, Augustin Bea, Jesuit Cardinal of the Roman Curia and President of the new founded Secretary of Christian Unity, confessed this interpretation of his biography to his assistant Jan Willebrands. In Bea's eyes, his life, at this time he was 79 years old, had a clearly defined goal. The Second Vatican Council and the commitment to ecumenical and Jewish-Christian dialogue. Indeed, what Bea is known for until today is exactly this. He still is one of the most popular council fathers and the council's face of dialogue. One of the masterminds behind important documents like the dogmatic constitution Dei Verbum, the decree on ecumenism Unitatis Ret Integratio, and the most important for us today, Nostra Aetate. Pictures like the one we can see here are well known. The elderly cardinal is in conversation with important personalities, here with Abraham Joshua Heschel, Jewish theologian and pioneer of Jewish-Christian dialogue. But we always see Bea as a man of about 80 years. The interpretation of his biography, we have heard, led for decades to publications focusing on in a teleological way on Bea's activities during the council. For most of his early biographers, the early life was only preparation. There is, of course, a danger that we interpret a biography retrospectively from the perspective of the last decades of his life and see the thinking of the Cardinal of Unity everywhere. Only if we trace Bea's personal, theological, and church political development, we understand better how he could get one of the fathers of Nostra Aetate. Bea's evolution as a person of dialogue is strongly linked to the history of the Pontifical Biblical Institute here in Rome. Therefore, I will concentrate on Bea's 35 years as professor for Old Testament exegesis and his 19 years as rector of the Biblicum in the moving years from 1930 to 1949. First of all, I would like to give a short overview of Bea's early biography and the scientific development of the Institute in these decades. In a second step, we will focus on some early contacts to Jewish scholars in Bible exegesis and Oriental studies from the 1930s to the 1950s. Finally, I would like to offer a brief outlook on Bea's activities when Pope John the 23rd decided to let the Secretary for Christian Unity prepare a draft on Catholic-Jewish relations for the Council. And finally, we can ask to what extent the early experiences prepared Bea for Nostra Aetate. When Augustin Bea arrived in Rome in September 1924, he could look back to different experiences he had already made as professor at Jesuit Collegium Magnum in Valkenburg in the Netherlands and as Father Provincial of the South German Jesuit province. Bea, born in 1881, grew up in a small village in the southwest of Germany near the Swiss border. When he entered the Jesuit order, he had to leave Germany and studied in Valkenburg. He was educated in the typical neo-scholastic system of education the Jesuit order was known for in the 19th century. During the Valkenburg years, Bea also got in contact with the events of the so-called modernist crisis that shook Catholic theology all over the world before the First World War. From his professors and colleagues, Bea learned a specific caution that was widespread, especially under Catholic exegetes, due to the decisions of Pope Pius X from 1905 to 1915. The Pontifical Biblical Commission had given clear orders concerning the debates within the study of Old and New Testament. For giving only one example, in 1909, it declared the first 3 chapters of the Genesis to factual reports. Catholic exegetes were allowed to work historically, but only to demonstrate the traditional reading of the Bible was correct. To accept the results and hypotheses of Protestant exegesis instead was finally taboo. Pius X had also founded this Pontifical Biblical Institute in 1909 to demonstrate what Catholic exegesis should be like. Bea himself was convinced that these measures were necessary and that Catholic research on the Bible had to be cautious. But he also favored a deeper knowledge of the languages, the history, cultures, and archaeology of the ancient Orient, which he had received in 1913 at the University of Berlin. We come back to Bea's hermeneutical convictions in a moment. Another topic Bea, especially as Old Testament scholar, got to know very early was anti-Semitism. In 1920, Bea already wrote an article entitled, I translate in English, Anti-Semitism, Race Theory and Old Testament. Against famous anti-Semitic publications in Germany. Although Beer drew a clear red line between Christians and racist anti-Semitism, Beer focused on protecting the Old Testament and ancient Israel from every accusation, but not the contemporary Jews, by using very common anti-Semitic stereotypes. The topic accompanied him also in his next phase of life, when he, in 1921, became the first Father Provincial of the new founded South German Jesuit province in Munich. In the first years after the First World War, Munich unfortunately became one of the centers of anti-Semitic, nationalist and paramilitary groups. And these groups often combined anti-Semitic, anti-Bolshevistic and anti-Jesuit propaganda, so we can see conspiracy theories at work. And Beer was one of the voices against. He tried with his article. As already mentioned, coming to Rome in 1924 changed Beer's life completely. In the center of Catholicism under Pius X, the anti-modernist witch hunt was over, and 2 generations of experts worked together at the Biblicum. Professors at the biblical faculty, we see them all here on this picture of 1937. Professors of the biblical faculty taught introduction and exegesis, history and archaeology of the Old and New Testament times. For example, Beer's vice rector, Alberto Vaccari, was an important Old Testament exegete in Italy with a great influence. And Augustinus Merck, for example, tried to introduce a Catholic version of the later so-called Nestle Aland, a critical edition of the New Testament. Well known were also the Orientalist experts like Anton Daimel, who worked for his whole life on a Sumeric grammar and dictionary. Pope Pius XI wanted to strengthen this form of Catholic working on the Bible and the research at the Biblicum that could get accepted also in a secular context. Beer, who appreciated this, became rector of the Biblicum in 1930. And what did he do in this, with this new task? In 1931, the Orientalist faculty was established, so there were many experts, and now there was a own faculty. Already in the 1920s, the scientific journal Biblica started to be published. Now, with Orientalia, a new journal come to life. Another important area of research was the excavations carried out by the Biblicum since 1929 in Tel Elat Gassul, near the Dead Sea, which was supervised by the Jerusalem branch of the Institute. The first volume of the excavation report was published in 1934, just in time for the Institute's 25th anniversary. In 1930 already, in order to the plans of Alberto Vaccari, the Biblicum offered for the first time the Settimana Biblica. This summer school, held every September, should give professors for Bible exegesis from all over Italy the opportunity to connect and to learn more about recent trends and publications in biblical studies. Here we have an overview of the topics that were discussed in the Settimane Bibliche, and we can see a wide range. It started with prophets and early Jewish eschatology and research on the Gospels and life of Jesus in 1930, Messianism and apocalyptic thinking in the last 2 pre-Christian centuries, inspiration of the Scripture, redemption in the New Testament, St. Paul and his theology, Pentateuch, Middle East archaeology, and eschatology in the New Testament. Due to the increasing number of participants, the event developed a major influence on Catholic biblical scholarship in Italy. The overview of topics also shows the development of research at the Biblicum. Until the 1950s, the Institute became a center of fundamental research concerning the languages and cultures of the ancient Orient, the literary character of the Old Testament, and the historical context of the life of Jesus. We can see this clearly from the publications of the professors as well as from the students' dissertations in the 1940s and 1950s. Also, very common topic here were the Dead Sea Scrolls found in the end of the 1940s, and then the excavations in Qumran. Also, Bea wrote many articles about it. When Bea took office as rector in 1930, it was not yet clear in which direction Catholic Bible exegesis would move. Augustin Bea played a decisive role in this slow change process until the 1940s. As scholar and as rector, he was a team player, networker, and already a politician. He slowly moved to the level of decision makers within the Roman Curia. These efforts resulted in Pius XII's encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu of 1943 on Catholic Bible exegesis. A very important decision, but due to the time, I mentioned it only here. Let's move to the early Jewish contacts. In his commentary on Nostra Aetate, titled La Chiesa e il Popolo Giudeo, published in 1966, Bea gave advices for Jewish-Christian dialogue. I quote, "Cooperation between Christians and Jews in biblical and theological studies is of great importance. It can indeed help to shed more and more light on the various points of common spiritual heritage, to clarify the difficulties, or at least to define their own positions in this regard." End of quote. Indeed, Bea knew what he was talking about. In his everyday life of teaching at the Biblicum for 3 decades, Bea often worked with the publications of Jewish scholars and over years got into personal contact. One early example to illustrate this is the textbook on the Pentateuch, published in 1928, with a second edition in 1933. In it, Bea not only discussed contemporary Protestant Pentateuch theories, but also Jewish research. Hereby, he clearly indicates the religious or confessional affiliations of the authors he mentions for the students by adding Akatholicus or Israeliticus. But unlike the Protestant authors, most of whom he quotes in order to refute their thesis, he applied the studies of Jewish colleagues, for example, of Benno Jakob, Umberto Cassuto, David Hoffmann, and others. Especially Benno Jakob, rabbi in Göttingen and Dortmund and Bible exegete, like Bea, criticized the Pentateuch theory of the Protestant Julius Wellhausen, who distinguished different sources within the Pentateuch and therefore questioned the traditional position of Moses and the chronological sequence of the history of Israel. For Bea, as a Catholic, this position was unacceptable because of the tradition of the Church and the dogma of the inerrancy of the Scripture. For Jacob, as a Jew, it questioned the core of Jewish identity: the Exodus, the covenant at Mount Sinai, and the Torah. Both Bea and Jacob were convinced that understanding the Bible better by learning more about its historical context did not necessarily mean to relativize it as Holy Scripture. But reading and applying the thoughts of Jewish authors was not yet a dialogue. This changed with an important event here in Rome, the International Orientalist Congress in 1935. The Biblicum took part, and the rector invited the participants to some events here in this building. According to the list of participants and Bea's report to the Father General of the Jesuits, there was also a respectable number of Jewish scholars. For the first time, Bea and his colleagues met the authors they had read. We can see that in the following years, the guests frequently published articles within the Institute's journal Orientalia. Beer and his confrere Alfred Pohl, the editorial director of Orientalia, stayed in contact with different personalities. This is remarkable if we respect the fact that in 1935 in Germany, the Nuremberg racial laws, and 3 years later, in 1938, also racial laws in Italy came into force, with consequences also for Jewish scholars who lost their posts here in Italy and sometimes had to go to exile. Orientalia became a small, safe space where they again could publish their research results also from the exile. In Biblica, the exegetical journal, instead, only a few linguistic articles, for example, of Israele Zolli, the later Grand Rabbi of Rome, for example, were published in the 1930s. Another example related to the racial laws in Italy was the story of the later famous Orientalist Sabatino Moscati. In 1939, he originally wanted to study ancient Oriental languages at La Sapienza University, but he was rejected due to his background. In this situation, he got in contact with Beer and asked for the possibility to start his study at the Biblicum. Indeed, the statutes of the Orientalist faculty allowed lay people to study at the Biblicum with a guest status. So Beer gave the permission to Moscati, who started to study with huge commitment. 3 years later, he had absolved all lectures that were obligatory for the candidates to the final exams. But students with a guest status had no right to absolve the exams and to get a diploma. Since Beer considered Moscati extremely talented, Beer wrote to the prefect of the Vatican's Congregation for Seminaries and Universities, Giuseppe Cardinal Pizzardo, and explained the situation. I quote, "Because Moscati belongs to the Jewish race and the Israelite religion in 1939, after passing the classical baccalaureate, he could not be enrolled at a state university due to the Italian law for the protection of the race, and he asked if he could do his Oriental studies at our institute," end of quote. Even though Beer adopted the jargon of fascist legislation in his letter, by trying to help Moscati, he showed his dislike of the oppression of the Jews. The rector argued that it was an exceptional situation and that it was a degree in Oriental studies and not a biblical one. At last, Pizzardo agreed and Moscati could register for the exams. This did not only open a scientific career for him, but also saved his life. During the German occupation from September 1943 until June 1944, Beer and other Jesuits from the Biblicum helped Moscati to flee and hide. Thanks to new research done here at the Biblicum in the archive, we can see that Moscati was not a single case. The bursar, the financial administrator of the Biblicum, Gozzolino Birolo, helped Jewish families with the consent of Rector Beer. In 1944, after the liberation of Rome, Birolo prepared a list of about 4,000 Jews saved in convents, monasteries, and other ecclesiastical institutions like the Biblicum. The Biblicum was one of these institutions. This shows how deep Birolo and also Beer was involved in this humanitarian aid. Under these persons, we can also find the Grand Rabbi of Rome, Israele Zolli. Zolli, of course, is a particular character. Born in today's Ukraine, he studied in Florence theology, Semitic languages, and the ancient Orient. Later, he became rabbi of Trieste and gave lectures at the University of Padua. In the 1930s, he got to know Beer and they stayed in contact. After the racial laws of 1938, he lost his post at the university and came to Rome, where he got the Grand Rabbi. In this time, he tried to publish some articles in Biblica. After the German occupation, he survived hidden in a monastery. He converted to Catholicism, and Bea was his baptismal godfather. Until 1955, he taught Hebrew and rabbinic literature at the Biblicum. Although Dolly's rule during the occupation and his later conversion was criticized by parts of the Jewish community, Bea and the Biblicum stayed in a good contact, also with the new Grand Rabbi of Rome, Elio Toaff. Now we come to the preparation of the Second Vatican Council. When Pope John XXIII had announced the Second Vatican Council in January 1959 and in 1960, most letters of bishops, religious orders, and Catholic universities from all over the world with suggestions for the upcoming council had arrived, the Catholic-Jewish relations played a marginal role. Only in the vote of the Pontifical Biblical Institute we find a paragraph named De Antisemitismo Vitando about preventing antisemitism. As we have already seen, it is not surprising that the professors of the Biblicum were sensible enough to such a suggestion. It was about an appreciative attitude towards Judaism, a critical examination of the Church's own anti-Semitic past, and the erudition of anti-Semitic passages in liturgy and official ecclesiastic documents. Here we find points that were also important on the agenda of a growing number of Jewish Christian associations and dialogue initiatives. One of the most prominent characters of these movements was the French historian and survivor of the Holocaust, Jules Isaac, who had met John XXIII in 1960 in a private audience, which until today can be seen as the decisive moment. After this audience, John XXIII gave Bea, only for a few months, cardinal and now secretary of the secretary for the Christian Unity, the order to prepare a declaration about the Christian teaching on the Jews. The topic he now had to deal with was well known for Bea. Bea appreciated the Pope's decision and supported the project and got in contact with Jewish organizations. And during one of these meetings, he met also Abraham Joshua Heschel in New York City. Both were exegetes and had worked, for example, on the Songs of the Songs, or reflected the concept of divine inspiration of the Bible. For Heschel, it must have been remarkable that Bea, in his commentary on the Song of the Songs from 1953, also reflected the question of whom being the people of God with the following sentences. I quote, "But just as in other messianic prophecies, the Church of the Old and New Testament are not distinguished but understood as two modes of being of one of the same thing. Also as the bride of the Song of the Songs is the people of God, who are chosen by him in a special way and are led in different paths and ways of thinking gradually to perfect unity in love with God," end of quote. From the discussion with Heschel and others, Bea developed central aspects that led to the formulations we find in Nostra Aetate. The end of speaking of the Jews as murderers of God, of the Jews being cursed by God and being no longer his chosen people. Also, he preferred an appreciative view of the common heritage of Christians and Jews, especially because of the Jewishness of Jesus, Mary, and all apostles. In 1962, Bea wanted to explain these theological arguments in an article in the Jesuit journal La Civiltà Cattolica that also should be published in different languages. Unfortunately, because of the political quarrels after the plan of a declaration about the Jews within the council went to public, and it caused some diplomatic crisis for the church in the Middle East, Cardinal Secretary of State Domenica Tardini strictly forbid the publication. However, the editor of the German journal Stimmen der Zeit, Ludwig Hertling, still wanted to publish the article and, consulting with Beer, published it under his own name. In the article, most classical anti-Judaic topoi were discussed from a biblical point of view. At least Beer's argument argues here based on St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where the apostle hopes that Israel will also find the way to redemption, very similar to the sentences we have in Nostra Aetate. As Old Testament expert, Beer used also a biblical argumentation. Via informal contacts, the text was translated in different languages and came back to Rome and was widespread under the Council Fathers, and so these arguments went to the aula of the Council. And we can also see that it is remarkable that we have began with the suggestion of preventing anti-Semitism, and now we are in a fundamental change in theological thinking about Jews from a Catholic perspective. I come to an end now. Preparing for Nostra Aetate, the different aspects of Augustin Beer during his time here at the Biblicum show a continuous development of understanding Jewish exegesis and personal contacts. It took place between his early writing against anti-Semitism in 1920 and the preparation of the council. We clearly see that Beer in his early life was a different person from the Cardinal of Unity. He was not born as the council father of dialogue, but he learned more and more, and this process refers to his duties as exegete and rector. First, as an exegete, Beer's daily work was shaped by the tensions between fidelity and the urgent questions posed by modern research. Much more intensively than the representatives of other theological disciplines, he had to deal with achievements and theories of other fields of knowledge and people of other religious denominations. He therefore did not avoid the most pressing questions of the time. Second, Beer began to get to know Jewish exegesis by reading authors who worked on the same subjects. Surely he applied their results in a very selective way from the point of view of Catholic theology, and also the perception that Catholics and Jews were partners against Protestant exegesis. But he more and more got in contact with specific Jewish reading of the Bible. Third, Beer's way of dialogue was different from the early forms of an institutionalized Jewish-Christian dialogue. The Biblicum was an institution of scientific debates and in the 1930s became a safe space. Beer and his colleagues tried to hold a scientific community stable and to strengthen a civilized way of living together in the singular cases they were involved in, instead of anti-Semitism within society and the church as well. Fourth, Beer's experiences with Jewish colleagues whom he held in high esteem as scientists and who at the same time became innocent victims of persecution could be one reason why Beer also addressed the question of the Jews' path to salvation after the war. He further expanded the idea already raised in 1920 that the Jews were included in God's plan of salvation and that it was God alone to decide the future of his people. Perhaps it was precisely this endurance of this constant intellectual tension and the confrontation with ways of thinking that were at first sight contradictive to the own ecclesiastical tradition that formed the foundation that decades later was facilitated the development to one of the fathers of Nostra Aetate. Thank you for your attention.
We move on to our next speaker, Dr. Adela Valeria Messina. She received her PhD in contemporary history in January 2013 from the University of Calabria, southern Italy. Her research interests include anti-Semitism, interreligious dialogue, history of Holocaust sociology. Among her publications, her rather many publications, are volume American Sociology and Holocaust Studies, published in 2017 and now also available through open access. Someone commented, this is a one-volume history of the sociology of the Holocaust. She also edited other volumes, and she had teaching positions at the University of Calabria and Palermo, and recently she became, she got a position in Parma, at the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences and Culture. And there she conducts research on the theological reactions to the conquest of Jerusalem in 1917 and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Today, she will speak about Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's influence on Nostra Aetate. His famous and controversial 1964 article, Confrontation, has been the most influential Orthodox Jewish voice in the debate about Nostra Aetate and Jewish-Christian relations. We are looking forward to hearing your take on this.
Let me thank you, any of you, for your presence here, and the organizer especially. And let me share with you the contribution of Rabbi Soloveitchik towards Nostra Aetate, the declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. Paying particular attention to number 4, I will examine how the Rav addressed the issue of Jewish-Christian dialogue before and after the declaration. The unusual use of the preposition towards is a particular and indicative of the Rabbi Soloveitchik's far-reaching effort to achieve a constructive, a paramount dialogue between religions. But at the core of this contribution is a crucial question. In what terms is it possible to advance the idea that Rabbi Soloveitchik dealt with the interreligious dialogue in a parallel way to the Church? And to answer this question, we need to use the terms loneliness and mathematics. And for this reason, I will subdivide this contribution in 2 sections. The first section will address Rabbi Soloveitchik's passion for mathematics in terms of its connection to interreligious dialogue. I will align the Rav's concept of Jewish-Christian dialogue and the lonely man of faith with his unpublished discourse speech, Lavan and Techelet, of the end of the 1970s. And this pairing will challenge the traditional interpretation that 2 of his main disciples, David Hartman and Shlomo Riskin, follow. Because for them, the confrontation is Rabbi Soloveitchik's only work on interreligious dialogue. I, by contrast, will argue that the Rav began to formulate his thoughts on interreligious dialogue well before the confrontation and continued to deal with the topic after it. The second section instead will focus more specifically on the term of loneliness that I will try to address by addressing the Rav's choice to use the epithet of espousal, marriage, relying on the biblical passages from Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:21, always in terms of its connection to Jewish-Christian dialogue. To conclude, Rabbi Soloveitchik's indirect discovery of Jesus the Jewish is covered in this contribution. But before to enter the two sections, let me acquaint with the topic. At an interfaith seminar at St. John's Catholic Seminary in Brighton, Massachusetts, in 1964, Rabbi Soloveitchik first presented The Lonely Man of Faith. Its basic ideas had already been, I quoted Rabbi Korn, formulated in these lectures to the students of the program Marriage and Family, held at the National Institute of Mental Health project at Yeshiva University in New York City in 1958-1959. Rav's seminar presentation before an audience being a mix of Jews and Christians and dealing with Jewish-Christian dialogue came almost a year before Nostra Aetate. It came at a time when the church, I'm quoting always Rabbi Korn, still adhered to its age-old theological posture towards Jews and Judaism. I'm ending the quoting. As we will see in the second section, the Rav used the analogy of marriage as an analytical device to understand the complicated relations between Jews and Christians, which culminated in the Holocaust and which makes interreligious dialogue urgent, imperative. Always quoting Rabbi Kov, the Holocaust demonstrated for all who were honest that something had gone horribly wrong in Christendom. And many Catholics from Pope John XXIII downward deemed the reconsideration of their Jewish spiritual patrimony and the Church's relations with the Jewish people to be urgent necessities. Studies on the Rav's confrontation, his standard work on the interreligious dialogue, has been fructiferous in the last decades, as evident, for instance, by the symposium Rabbi Soloveitchik on interreligious dialogue 40 years later, occurred on November 23, 2003 at the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. The symposium, inaugurated by Rabbi Korn, Rabbi Berger, and so on, extended into subsequent months in the form of an online conversation that included leading scholars such as Rabbi Brill, Erika Brown, Rabbi Rosen, Rabbi Sachs. However, the Boston College conversation did not touch on Rabbi Soloveitchik's love for mathematics and its connection with the Jewish-Christian dialogue. Before to delve into these two sections, it's paramount to remember quickly the person of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Who was he? Rabbi Soloveitchik has been and is one of the most prominent individuals in contemporary Orthodox Judaism in the 20th century. He was born in 1903 in a town of Brest region, and he was a part of a notable Lithuanian rabbinic family. After obtaining his doctorate in Neo-Kantian epistemology at the University of Berlin, he emigrated in the 1930s to the USA at age 22. He was a teacher of Talmud at New York City Yeshiva University, and he explored the link between mathematics and the pursuit of religious freedom, having deep roots in the Talmudic Academy, Lithuanian Yeshiva. Thanks to the tradition of his grandfather, the great Rabbi Chaim Brisker, focused on conceptual precision and abstract analysis of Talmudic studies, the Rav depicted interreligious dialogue in its best light. So, the first section. The Rav connects interreligious dialogue and mathematics through the concept of loneliness. This is an important first mental step. In regards to faith, the term loneliness does not merely mean being alone, but also conveys the uniqueness of every individual, per Genesis 2:7. The mathematical equivalent of this loneliness is a spatial distance between particles. Here, Rabbi Soloveitchik has in mind the mathematical principles of natural philosophy by Isaac Newton. Particles have a form that allows them to move in space. And this form is formed from the unformed, from the mud or the dust of the ground, Adama. As a particle moves away from the other, it becomes distinct, unique, equal only to itself, and lonely. When the particle approaches another particle, it pulls towards a projection of itself. Rav's metaphor for human interrelation begins by examining the dual relationship between particles. Interrelation is the result of simultaneous drawing together, ether, and separation from each other, kenegdo, per Genesis 2:18. In addition, Rabbi Soloveitchik's concept of loneliness can be compared to the work of a British physicist Peter Higgs, who in 1964 conceived a subatomic field that sees massless particles gain because of their attraction to each other. Rav's idea of loneliness is portrayed in The Lonely Man of Faith and in Lavan and Techlet, as we will see. And it's grounded in Genesis chapter 1, from 1:21, when God creates through words, and in Genesis 2. Through mathematical concepts, the Rav explains how the religious human openness towards other religious beings is paradoxically illustrated in the existential loneliness. To the Rav, who brings mathematical imagination and religious consciousness together, the religious person exploring reality with the eye of his Torah is akin to a mathematician. Observing the cosmos and striving to fathom its inner mechanism and components, both the religious person and the mathematician aim to use and apply them in daily life, like Adam of the first chapter of Genesis, called Adam the First to the Rav, by the Rav. In addition, the religious individual is dedicated to finding solutions to questions such as social justice, human rights, and is dedicated to questioning his own consciousness. The Rav calls this person Adam the second, in the light of Adam of the second chapter of Genesis. For the Rav, this consciousness, the religious consciousness, the freedom of conscience, is essential after the Holocaust. Like mathematicians seeking the universe rules, individuals can face past misunderstandings. So, at this point, one may ask, after centuries of misunderstanding and anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust, what questions should we tackle about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? Bafflingly, the Rav is aware of the possibility of contradictions and challenges when trying to reach a dialogue between Jews and Christians. He has in mind the basic metaphysical difference separating individuals, analogous to the physical distance in space, which any particle moves freely in any direction. Religious individuals can overcome this space by building relationships with others like them, Ezer Kenegdo. To comprehend how this approach is challenging the traditional interpretation that consider the confrontation to be Rabbi Soloveitchik's only contribution to interreligious dialogue, it's paramount to consider now, even if quickly, confrontation. First, a talk given to the Rabbinical Council of America in February 1964, and then an article written. Confrontation is the article Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote in response to the Catholic-Jewish dialogue initiated by the Vatican Council II. As stated by Korn, I'm quoting, modern Orthodox leaders looked to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the one theologically sophisticated traditionalist with the sufficient authority to craft an appropriate and politically acceptable response. Finish of the quotation. Confrontation, published by the Rabbinical Council of America in Tradition in 1964, represents modern Orthodoxy's stance on dialogue between Jews and Christians. It's possible to notice that there is a continuum between the Rav's works. What is written in Confrontation had already been outlined in the 1958-1959 lectures and in the Brighton Seminar of 1964, then resystematized in 1965 in The Lonely Man of Faith, then ameliorated in the Addendum of 1967, only to return in 1970s in Lavan and Terhalet. What is paramount is this. Jewish-Christian cooperation is encouraged on social and political issues of mutual concern, while dialogue is discouraged on theological issues. Why? Because for him, interreligious dialogue differs from theological dialogue, since it's mediated by a religious logos. Faith shared in communicability must be the basis for it. Let us look at The Lonely Man of Faith, written in English rather than Hebrew. First, it encourages Jews and Catholics to collaborate culturally to advance religious dialogue with the objective of promoting shared humanity according to Genesis 1:27. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. To explain this, the Rav refers to the two biblical accounts of the creation of Adam. Two types of human beings come from them. Adam, the first of chapter 1 of Genesis, and Adam, the second of chapter 2 of Genesis. This explanation lets him approach the Jewishness of Jesus. To fully comprehend the new insights of the interreligious dialogue that was developed in the Lonely Man of Faith, an additional step is necessary. That is to compare Adam the first and Adam the second with the human beings depicted in his oral discourse, Lavan and Thechelet, delivered at the end of the 1970s. This further pairing demonstrates that Rav's use of marriage as a metaphor to address the Jewish-Christian dialogue. So, we can enter the second section. Precisely, I will start to analyze Adam the first and Adam the second in Lavan and Thechelet, to pass them to the same analysis, Adam of the first and Adam the second in the Lonely Man of Faith. So, Adam the first in Lavan and Thechelet. Adam the first may be represented by the color white. In classical Hebrew, Lavan. The idea of clarity and distinctness comes to mind. It deals with elementary truths that cannot be doubted. Lavan means, in the Rav's words, comprehension of the world, following the principle of cause and effect. Adam II can be symbolized by the opposite of Lavan, that is Thechelet. Thechelet is like the sea, like the cerulean blue sky, and it evokes the celestial throne, its inapproachability, its distance. It is something beyond touch, beyond possession. It is that which is beyond our understanding, something that is entangled in confusion. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's work on interreligious dialogue, he outlines that Lavan and Thechelet are simultaneously interacting and interdependent. In the same way as an husband and a wife, they are lonely in the deep religious sense. They symbolize two different human approaches to others and the outside world. It's necessary for any religious person, not only Jew, not only Christian, to adopt two perspectives at once. That of the victor, Adam the first, in Genesis 1:27, and that of accepting defeat, Adam the second, Genesis 2:18. Is it possible to approach the Jewishness of the Jews here? It's an important question. Why can this pairing be applied to interreligious dialogue? Just as in a marriage, where two people are united and have to learn to lead and follow each other, in interreligious dialogue, two religious human beings have to see in these two ways: accepting the world as a prism of Lavan relating to each other through shared doubt, perplexity, confusion, shared suffering, shared distance, Thechelet. Adam the first and Adam the second in the Lonely Man of Faith. In this important book, Adam the first looks at the world created by Elohim and admires the norms that underlie it. He is absorbed by Elohim majesty, and according to his command to fill the earth and subdue it and rule over, Genesis 1:27, is driven to become a creative individual. The ability of Adam the first to dialogue with another religious person is similar to the Rav's mathematical relation. This is because since Adam the first is in the image of God, and since any human is in the image of God, then all humans, any religious other, is in the image of God also. Here the echo of Nostra Aetate 5. When two religious individuals can see the image of God in each other, they are able to mathematically cancel the distance between them, and empathize in the deepest religious dimension. By quoting Korn, I remember Rabbi Soloveitchik pointing out in a public lecture that an intimation of God can be found in mathematics. Once infinity enters the domain of finite math, all the conventional rules for equations are shattered. Perhaps God's image makes us equal in our infinite sanctity, equal in our uniqueness. Adam the first, as per God's command to fill the earth, feels that he is tasked with reconstructing the world following the mathematical laws that govern it. This is a constructive creativity, is a consequence of the awareness that one is made in the image of God. That any human being is in some sense Elohim, and he can live the dominion over the world. And it's essential to religious dialogue. In what sense? Adam the First is committed to protecting any other religious person's faith from attempts and reduction or negation. Moreover, given that Adam the First is created at the same time of Eve, the Rav connects Adam the First's self-creative drive to fill the earth to broader socio-political issues such as war, peace, freedom, and social justice. Adam the Second instead is a human being assailed by doubts, perplexity, and confusion. Adam II, who was assigned to cultivate and tend the garden, views nature as a reality that should be experienced rather than mastered. In this way, Adam II can dialogue with the religious other in the form of Eve. Adam and Eve can dialogue, can recognize the loneliness in each other, the uniqueness of each other. And in this way, Adam II and Eve create a kind of a covenantal community, a marriage with their distinct identities. To Rabbi Soloveitchik, for there to be a union between the two individuals, there must be a metaphysical distance separating them, a difference, a free space. And to summarize, the lonely men of faith and Lavan and Thechlet provide us with a guide for conduct of interreligious dialogue. As Adam and Eve confront and rule over the world, recognizing each other's loneliness, aware of their sameness and difference, so must two religious human beings approach each other, emphasizing their shared goals in the face of the cosmic order. As already said, the dialogue must be conducted in the spirit of mutual respect. And the Rav's second precondition for the Jewish-Christian dialogue. So coming back to conclude to the previous question, after centuries of anti-Semitism culminating in the Holocaust, what questions should we tackle about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity? The answer can ground here. The marriage of Genesis 2:21 begins with Adam deep sleep, symbolizing the defeat. What does the Rav make of this defeat? Metaphorically, true dialogue between Jews and Christians can only happen after the defeat of the Holocaust. And after this falling into deep sleep, they come together to face anti-Jewish sentiment. Only through religious human beings who can experience defeat and empathize with the Jewish experience after the Holocaust can dialogue with the religious other take place in freedom and dignity. Let me conclude by reproposing the crucial question of the beginning, in which terms is it possible to advance the idea that Rabbi Soloveitchik dealt with the interreligious dialogue in a parallel way to the Church? I have focused very quickly here on the concept of loneliness, connecting it to the Rav's mathematics, the distance of 2 points in space, and the mathematical negation of that distance, and showing its bearing on interreligious dialogue. I've tried to track the beginnings of the interreligious dialogue in Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought, emphasizing that his elaboration does not start with the confrontation and does not finish with it. The lonely man of faith appears crucial. It's something more because it argues for the experience of God in other humans rather than others of one's own faith, Jewish and Christian. And this has involved various figures, Lavan and Thechlet, the 2 Adams. And for the Rav, this must be done by embracing both the social engagement of Adam the first and the capacity for union with the other of Adam the second. And now, I'm concluding. Let me share with you an important passage of Rabbi Soloveitchik in his unpublished speech of Lavan and Thechlet, because it's a kind of a clear summary of his thought. And marriage unites 2 people for 2 purposes: to see the world to the prism of Lavan, and also to be capable of meeting the world, confronting the world when it acts funny, when the world becomes mystery, mysterium tremendum, a frightening mystery, and the world becomes suffering and perplexing, and husband and wife are united to confront it, and particularly modern life. We have to confront both the Lavan experience and the Thechlet experience. And for that ability, one thing is necessary: a sense of loyalty. Thank you.
Fine. So we go to the second part of this evening. And we have the privilege of having here with us Rabbi David Meyer, who teaches at the Bea Center. He was ordained at Leo Baeck College in London after serving as a congregational rabbi in Brussels and in England. He taught at numerous universities in Europe, China, and Peru. At the Gregorian University, he has been teaching since 2010, concentrating on rabbinic literature, contemporary Jewish thought, and Jewish and Christian hermeneutics. He holds a doctorate from the Catholic University of Leuven. His more than a dozen books have been published in English, French, Italian, and Portuguese. Among his latest books are Dove Caino tuo fratello, un dialogo antico tra giudaismo e cristianesimo, and God, Checkmate, Midrashic Hermeneutics as Theological Medium, also published in 2021. In addition, he has published numerous articles in French and English. Now, tonight, he brings us a surprise. If you have seen the title of the last book, you see that he is thinking outside the box very often. His topic tonight is a concealed medieval argument about the Jewishness of Jesus. David.
Thank you very much. So, a surprise, yes, if a surprise is midrashic, then somehow this is what it might be. let me just say a few words of contextualization of what I want to present. I will try to go back to the Middle Ages, trying to discover, in fact, a possible early form of tension, dispute about the Jewishness of Jesus that is present in two texts, one a Jewish text and one a Christian text. And my hope is that the return to the Middle Ages might be useful to us to illustrate, to shed some light somehow on the more contemporary debate about the Jewishness of Jesus that we are used to. Now, we certainly know that the modern evocation of the Jewishness of Jesus is not something that went without rising controversies and stirring controversies. We can think of a pioneer in the field, so for instance, Abraham Geiger, who was very aware of the controversial nature of his work. We can think also about, on the Christian side, we can think about Harnack in 1900, who famously wrote this very interesting phrase, "What do you want with your Christ?" And the expression is interesting because it reflects, I think, quite powerfully on the sort of exasperation that maybe he had with this kind of Jewish claim on Jesus and the reflection on the Jewishness of Jesus. But the question can be put a little bit differently. Was the polemic about the idea of a Jewish Jesus, was that a polemic that was only shaped by modern scholarship? And this is when I thought it would be interesting to go back a few centuries back into the 12th and the 13th century. And let me try to explain why. The 12th and 13th centuries saw, as we know, a very strong degradation in the nature of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And it was a context of violence and increased tension. And I don't want to go through all of the details, but of course we know about the blood label in England, in France. We know about the expulsion of the Jews from France. We know about the massacres in York. The list is almost endless. But there was a particular emphasis maybe on something about the Jews studying Talmudic literature. And of course, we have, I didn't go through the whole list, but maybe the most famous one at that time, the burning of the Talmud in Paris. It was the same in Geneva, and so on. But there was a sense, I think, of an exasperation on the Christian side, a sense of an exasperation with the Jews, what is really termed a sort of a papal exasperation with the rabbinic focus on the Talmud and the Oral Torah in particular. And I just want to put that particular quote here from Erwin Resnick because it captures, I think, the feeling, if you want, at the time. There was, he writes, a growing conviction among Christians that leaving Jewish communities had substituted the Talmud for the Old Testament, abandoning the single most positive function that Augustine thought the Jews performed, namely to preserve and carry with them the text and the law of the Old Testament. And if this really was the case, if the Jews had no more Christian function as such, then on the Christian side there's a question that comes up, which is, why tolerate the Jews? Why tolerate them? Why not, in a way, renew efforts to convert the Jews, maybe in a more efficient way than what was done in the past? And in that context, if you want, what we witness, what we see, is the emergence of what is called a new proselytizing technique, in particular since the Barcelona disputation, where somehow there was a shift, or there is a shift that is taking place in Christian circles as to how to relate and how to convert Jews. And the shift took the following form. While the Jews were usually taken to listen to sermons, to Christian sermons, in the hope that the truth of the Christian faith would be discovered and accepted by them, then somehow now the church started to use rabbinic texts, citing rabbis, citing rabbinic teaching against Judaism. And this is an idea that Robert Chazen, the historian, has summed up in the following terms, which I want to read as well, because it captured the essence of it. If their own accepted literature could have been shown to reflect the truth of Christianity, then the Jews would have little recourse but to accept the consequences. So that's kind of the feeling at the time. Now, that perception had some very practical consequences. And in particular, it led to the production of documents and books which were written, for some, specifically in this purpose, and this is what I want to turn to and to look at now. Whoops. It should work. So, now that we have the historical and the polemical context in mind, let me focus on specifically two texts from the 13th century, two documents. One is the Pugio Fidei and the Dagger of Faith, and the other one is the Yalkut Shimoni. The first one is Christian, the other one is rabbinic. Those are two important documents, in the midst of which, I think, we can discover an interesting early medieval prefiguration of the more modern polemic about Jesus the Jew, as we are familiar with. So let me just say a few words about each of these two. I'll start with the Pugio Fidei, just a few snapshots so we remember. So this is a work that's composed by Raymond Martí, who was a Catalonian Dominican friar. It's a very polemical work. It's a little bit infamous, in fact. It's a work that is citing rabbinic text against Judaism. We have, interestingly, the autograph manuscript, or what we think really is the autograph manuscript at la Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris. And the date is probably around 1278, not 100% sure the date, but there's a dispute about that, but essentially that's the period. If I look on the Jewish side, we have another kind of work, which is called the Yalkut Shimoni. The Yalkut Shimoni was written by someone, or composed by someone called Shimon Adarshan. I put a question mark after Shimon Adarshan because we're not 100% sure. His name appears on the first page of the Venice edition of 1566, but it doesn't appear in the Editio Princeps. It's from Frankfurt. It's an anthology. It's huge. It's a huge anthology of Midrashic and Talmudic texts, absolutely enormous. We don't have the autograph manuscript, but there is a manuscript in Oxford from 1307, which is about the text of the compilation of Midrashic text and Talmudic text on the Torah. But we do have a complete Editio Princeps of Salonika, 1521, 1526, and essentially the belief is that this was written somewhere in the first part of the 13th century. Now, those are kind of comparable dates. It's kind of the same period. And there is something that is comparable about those texts, in particular in that they are a very useful record of rabbinic text. And what I want to try and do is to put those two texts in dialogue. Now, what do I mean when I said to put these two texts in dialogue? I think there is a word of serious caution and warning that needs to be put. My intention is not to suggest that the author of one would have been aware of what the other actually wrote, as if one could literally respond to the work of the other, because this is really not the case. Rather, the suggestion is that given that both works are enormous compilation, the suggestion is that there would have been a long period of gestation for this work, probably starting in the 12th century, and that the endeavor that would have gone into the composition of these works would have been something that they could have been both in a reciprocal way been aware of. And in essence, this is what someone like Ursula Ragas writes when she says about the Yalkut Shimoni, the passage you have here. She said the Yalkut Shimoni, this huge anthology of rabbinic text, could have been a privileged entry point for Christian polemists into rabbinic knowledge. Where did the Christians knew about the rabbinic text? Well, maybe there was the construction of such an anthology, not necessarily the result as the Yalkut Shimoni, but the construction of it they might have been aware of. Now, we can look at it maybe the other way around, just to flip the coin on the other side, and this is more personally my take, is to wonder, and I'm careful with the words here, to think that the Yalkut Shimoni could be a counter-narrative, a rabbinic counter-narrative to interpretative attempts by Christian polemists. This is not to say that the Yalkut Shimoni is responding to the Pugio Fidei, it doesn't work with dates, but if we take the momentum it would have been necessary to create those works, then maybe the Yalkut Shimoni is a counter-narrative to those interpretative attempts. So now that we've kind of set the scene, I would like to turn to one particular Midrashic text that is cited both in the Pugio Fidei and in the Yalkut Shimoni. So it's the same text. And I want to try and discover how the way this Midrash is cited in both works can somehow reflect on the Jewishness of Jesus' question. So that's the aim of what I would like to try and do. Now, here's the Midrash. We'll look at it in English in a minute. It's taken from Midrash Tehillim, which is the collection on the book of Psalm. The date of composition is a little bit uncertain. It varies greatly. I won't go into the detail of that. This is Midrash Tehillim 2:9, and it's Psalm 2:7, which is, of course, a verse that is interesting in terms of the nature of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Adonai amar elai beni ata, the Eternal said to me, you are my son. So obviously this verse has been taken. And what I want to suggest and to do is it's quoted in the Yalkut Shimoni and in the Pugio Fidei, and I want to proceed, if you want, in 3 steps. First, I want to take literally 1 minute to actually read the Midrash. 2, I want to do a little hermeneutical detour so I can try to explain briefly what I think the function of this Midrash is, how it works and what is its purpose. And 3, I will put the emphasis on one single aspect of that text, which is cited both in the Yalkut Shimoni and the Pugio Fidei, and that will bring us back to the original question of a concealed argument about the Jewishness of Jesus. So let me read the text. You have it here. There's some colors that I've put here. Those are the quotes. I will tell of the decrees. The Lord said to me, you are my son. That's Psalm 2:7. They are told in the decree of Torah, in the decree of the prophets, in the decree of the Ketuvim. It is written in the decree of the Torah, one quote, my son, my firstborn, Israel, Exodus 4. And it is written in the decree of the prophets, here we have 2 quotes, behold, my servant shall act wisely. And it is written also after, behold, it's not really after, but it is also written, behold, my servant whom I uphold, and that is also from Isaiah. And then it is written in the decree of the Ketuvim, last part of the Tanakh, 3 quotes now, saying of the Lord, sit at my right hand, Psalm 110, and it is written, the Lord said to me, you are my son, that's our quote, the one we're working on, and it quotes Daniel 7:13 to finish, behold, with the clouds of heaven, like a son of man, Kevarenash, he came. Now, we read the text, and as often with the Midrash, it's very obscure, it's kind of not very explicit. Certainly what we can say is that it resists immediate interpretation, which is something that we really always find in Midrash. So let me try to make some sense of what we've just read and do this short hermeneutical detour, which is needed for what I want to do after. And I will focus on one possible reading of that text without going into other reading, and certainly without going into the kind of hardcore hermeneutic of the text. So the question really is, what is the main, what's the Midrash about? What is it trying to do? I think what we can say is it's a polemical narrative with Christianity, and what it says is it's trying to say that engraved in Tanakh, engraved in the Bible, is the reference to Beni, my son. And so that therefore there's nothing new. There's nothing new to read in the reference to my son. In a way, if I were to sum that up, I would say the Midrash tried to deactivate the possibility of reading sonship into that rabbinic text, which, as I said, is going to be quoted in the Pugio Fidei to be turned against Judaism. And the way it does that, it does this in 3 steps, which the computer is a rebel like me. Here it is. First, it looks at the Torah, and it gives a quote from the Torah, and it's quote Exodus 4:22, and he says, Bani Bechori Israel. He says, my son, my firstborn Israel. The subject is Israel, has nothing to do with the son. He used the son, but it means Israel. Then he talks about the prophet. He gives 2 quotes, and here the 2 quotes from Isaiah are put together. I skip the details, but it's to say the reference to the son is not the son, it's the Eved, it's the servant of the Eternal. And then it looks at the Ketuvim, and it ends up by putting the quotes together, saying it's not really Ben, it's Kevar. It's like a son, but it's not really a son. So we understand that the overall idea of the text is Beni Ata, you are my son, has nothing to do with sonship in a Christian sense, and it's something that is present in the Tanakh, and it means either Israel or the servant, or it means eventually like a son, but in fact it's not a son. So let me move a little bit further into the hermeneutics and just narrow down the focus, which really is what will be of interest to us, which is the last part of the text, the Chukah Shel Ketuvim. What is it that we find in the prophet, the Ketuvim about that particular quote? Now, what comes now is a typical example of a midrashic hermeneutical method of kind of weaving together verses. It takes 3 verses and it puts the verses together in order to try to make a point. And the way it works is this. It starts with Psalm 110:1, and we have it here. Neum Adonai la'Adoni shev le'yamini. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. And as often in Midrash, you have a quote, and then you need to read a little bit what's before, a little bit what's after, to try to see how it works. And what you have after is verse 3 that I put here. Okay? Merechem mishachar lecha tal yaldutecha. From the womb of the morning, the dew of the morning, or the dew, will be yours. And I've put some colors that you can see here. The blue are the text, the words which reflects or evoke a real son. Here, merechem, from the womb. Okay, it's really, and the words in yellow, as you can see in a minute, will be transformative words, the words with which I think the Midrash is working in order to change the meaning of the text. So that's the first quote. The second quote is our text, the passage from Psalm 2:7. Adonai amar elai, beni ata ani hayom yoladeticha. Beni ata, in blue, you are my son, very earthly. And yoladeticha, I have given birth to you. And the last passage is from Daniel 7, kevar enash ata. And you see, this is going to be transformative. See how it works. It's almost as if, that's at least my reading, the birth, yoladeticha, which is on Psalm 2:7, the middle one, could be read with verse 3 of Psalm 110. It's not Yeladeticha, it's Yaldutecha. It's spelled the same way. So it's not really the birth, but it's a youthful moment. And of course, as I mentioned before, the Beni Ata, you are my son, is Kevar Enash. It is like a son, but not really a son. So again, the key idea is probably, as I tried to say, to deactivate the possibility of the concept of sonship that could be present in that text. Now that we have this in mind, and we've seen that the hermeneutical construct of the Midrash, I'm arriving at the key element of what I want to discuss, which is how that same text, just the last part on the Ketuvim, how that text is cited in both the Yalkut Shimoni and the Pugio Fidei. And you see the Yalkut Shimoni here. I use the Salonika Editio Princept. It's a one-liner. It's just the first line. What you have erased after is the Christian censor, okay? Which is not very useful because the Christian censor you can find in the Pugio Fidei without the censorship. But you have the first line, and you have here 2 short quotes. In red, Psalm 110:1, 3 words. And with a green circle, if you can read it, I hope, with a green circle, you have the passage from Psalm 2, the 4 or 5 words, Adonai Amar Elai, Beni Ata, the Eternal said to me, you are my son. Then there's a little bit of a space at the end of the line, and then it goes on. It's the same kind of topic, but it's not the Midrash as such. It becomes very visual because you see what happened in the Pugio Fidei. It's very long. The Pugio Fidei cites extensively. So very visibly, there is a difference in size. The Pugio Fidei is extensive, and in particular, as you'll see, it cites the whole citation of Daniel 7:13 plus verse 14. And by opposition, the Yalkut Shimoni is extremely minimalist. So what do we make of this? What kind of observation we can have? Apart from saying that the Yalkut Shimoni usually, because it's so big, it usually shortens the citation. This is something that is kind of classic in the Yalkut Shimoni. But the question we can have is that in the one-liner of the Yalkut Shimoni, there is one thing that disappears, is Daniel 7. The quote of Daniel 7 is not there anymore. In the Pugio Fidei side, we see it cites in 4, we said. The Pugio inverts Daniel 7 and Psalm 2 in the structure of the text. And there are 2 additions. One is Daniel 7, verse 14, which you'll remember, that's why I did the hermeneutical detour. Daniel 7, verse 14 is not needed for the understanding of the Midrash in its rabbinic sense. That's why it's interesting it's there. And then it also adds explicit Psalm 110:3. It doesn't quote verse 2, but it quotes verse 1, and then it quotes verse 3. Now that would be useless, completely useless, unless we have some sort of information about what sort of idea we can have about what are the textual witnesses that both the Yalkut Shimoni and the Pugio Fidei could have used when they were copying the text, because after all, those are anthologies, so they were copying a text. So the question is really what textual witness of both we could have used. And to make the question very clear as possible, my question is there meaning to what we see in these 2 works and what we find in these 2 works if they are only citing what was in front of their eyes? So here's the result of a little research, and I'll go very quickly on this. This is something that's done by consulting extant manuscript on the topic. It's difficult to go through all of them, but somehow it gives an idea. My focus here is just on the quotation of the 3 passages from Psalm 110, Psalm 2, and Daniel 7. So we have here some elements, and I'll give you the summary of this, which really answers the question, what is it that we find when we consult the extant manuscript that we know of the Midrash on Psalm that predates, for those ones, the redaction of the Yalkut Shimoni and the Editio Princeps. What we see is that Daniel 7 is not cited, is only 1 manuscript. So the absence of Daniel 7 only appears in 1 manuscript. It's not cited in the Yalkut Shimoni, but in 1 manuscript it doesn't happen. When the quotes are cited, it's only usually the first few words. Daniel 7:14 is never cited, never, in none of the extant manuscript of Midrash Tehillim. And Psalm 110, verse 3, is also never cited. So that leaves us with things we know. We know that the Yalkut Shimoni abridges the sources. We could suppose maybe that the Yalkut used the Vorlag of the Parma edition, which doesn't quote Daniel. Why not? The Yalkut Shimoni is so short as a one-liner that there is a question, why? Why is it so short? And on the side of the Pugio Fidei, we have a few comments. Possibly the author of the Pugio Fidei used another manuscript that is non-extant of Midrash Tehillim, so he was quoting another text, which was in form, but we don't have. But if we go with what we know and what we have, we can also make the supposition that maybe he did a deliberate extension by adding Daniel 7, verse 14, and not just verse 13, and a deliberate expansion of verse 3 of Psalm 110. And that leaves us with questions about both those works. About the Yalkut Shimoni, there is an interesting question. Why is the Yalkut Shimoni taking the risk of being so short to the point of losing the meaning of the text? It is not understandable when it is quoted in such a short way. And this is important because the redactor of the Yalkut Shimoni, Shimon Darshan, is considered to be the Rosh Darshanim. He's the head of the expounder. He's supposed to be a master midrashist. And we have question on the Puggio side. What is the effect of what we've seen? Of adding Psalm 110:3, of adding the quote verse 14 of Daniel, of interverting two of the passages? What is the combined effect of all of that? In particular, as I said, since Daniel 7:14 is not needed for understanding what the Midrash was about. So now what comes here is a little bit midrashically speculative. And I just want to focus first on what we see on the Puggio Fidei side, trying to make some sense of the way the Puggio Fidei cites the text. I think the relationship between the two citations, which is Daniel 7:14 and Psalm 110:3, which are so specific of the Puggio Fidei, it provides a fertile mixture between ethnic belonging, Jesus the Jew, ethnic belonging, and incarnated birth. And here's why I'm saying this. If you look at the passage from Daniel 14, I've put in blue here some words which have a connotation of ethnic identity. Amamiya, Umaya, Ulishanaya, the people, the nation, the language. Now, of course, those do not define the subject of Daniel 7, which is the Kevar Enash, like a son of man. But nevertheless, I think the presence of that verse introduces kind of buzzwords about ethnic identity in the midst of a midrash in which it is not needed. Again, I re-emphasize that point. And on the other side, if we look at the addition of Psalm 110, verse 3, here, we have here a verse that is cited that adds explicit allusions to the image of the physical birth in a holiness context, which is the passage in red, the majestic holiness from the womb, in the midst of some ethnicity, which is in blue. There is your people, and there is the youth, your youth, at the end. If this is the case, the redactor or the composer of the Puggio Fidei should maybe be considered as a master midrashist as well. And Daniel 7 would be the intermediary step to introduce ethnicity into the reading of Psalm 110 and Psalm 2:7. So what we see is that possibly the Puggio Fidei, in adding Daniel 7:14 and making it, by inverting the order of the quote, the center of the Midrash, introduces as a key element of the Midrash a strong allusion to the ethnic belonging of the Eved or the Kevar Enash, or maybe Jesus in the Puggio context of its own reading, and thus creating, in a way, a surprising link between ethnic son and sonship. Now, the evocation of the theological relationship or the possible theological relationship between the son and the sonship, as far as I know, is not something that in such an explicit way is so common in Christian teaching. I'm certainly completely outside of my field here, but I did speak to a few people just to make sure I wasn't talking complete nonsense. And I just want to take kind of two exceptions here. One is a passage from Galatians 4:4-5, which I think is interesting for the purpose of what we're saying. But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, so sonship, born of a woman, ethnic son, born under the law, ethnic belonging, to redeem those under the law that we might receive adoption to sonship. We skip 2,000 years, and we have something fairly similar from Karl Barth. He comes out of Israel, born of Mary, the Virgin, and yet from above. So again, this mixture of what I put in blue and what I put in red. And the question, of course, is the Puggio Fidei standing somewhere in the middle by quoting Daniel 7:14 in particular, is it standing in the middle, evoking explicitly the ethnic dimension, the Jewishness of Jesus, in relation to the sonship? Is that what we have? As if, in a way, the Jewishness of Jesus could be a stepping stone for the affirmation of his sonship. On the side of the Yalkut Shimoni, it's going to go much faster. We're almost at the end. By contrast, in a way, the redactional choice of the Yalkut Shimoni raises an important hermeneutical question that I've mentioned before. We've noticed how minimalist it is. You again have it here. It's just a one-liner. Why taking the risk of losing the meaning of that midrash by being so short? Why does he do that? Now, we know that the Yalkut Shimoni always abbreviates the sources, but here there's a feeling that there is maybe a little bit more at stake. Maybe as if there was a sense that since there could be no sonship, then there should be no son of Israel. And I put here negating or avoiding the Jewishness of, and I put Jesus in parentheses because, of course, the Yalkut Shimoni doesn't talk about Jesus. The Yalkut Shimoni talks about the Ben, the Kevar Enash, like the Son of Man. He talks about the Eved, maybe of Isaiah, but could he have been aware that those were understood as Jesus in the context of the 12th and 13th century that I mentioned, therefore avoiding the subject, trying to see this as, this is dangerous territory for me, and just writing just a one-liner and not going into much detail. And that brings me to the last slide, which is simply a way to conclude, I suppose, wrapping up what I tried to explicit in bringing the Yalkut Shimoni and the Pugio Fidei in dialogue on this particular midrash. I just want to make 3 comments, which I hope can be helpful to our own discussion on the rediscovery of the Jewishness of Jesus. The first one is, how does the Pugio Fidei brings us to think anew the Jewishness of Jesus as Son of Israel in relation to the sonship? What is that relationship, if there is? To me, it's not obvious at all. I don't quite see what it is, but I'm puzzled by what I found. The second question is the Pugio Fidei, in a way, more daring than the Yalkut Shimoni as to the Jewishness of this individual that we talk about either in Psalm 2 or in Daniel 7? Is the Pugio Fidei more daring in explicitly referring to the ethnic belonging? And last, is the redactor of the Yalkut Shimoni intuitively aware of the possible theological relationship between Jesus the Jew, the ethnic son, and Jesus the incarnated son? How can he have been aware of such a relationship if there was one? So I hope that these questions, which are taken from just one very small textual example, and while they emerge from the distant Middle Age, can still be useful to our contemporary discussion on the rediscovery of the Jewish Jesus. Thank you very much.